Brandon, that good prayer. I appreciate that. I want to welcome everyone to our Wednesday night worship service. I guess this is the last Wednesday night before Christmas, so it'll be my opportunity to say Merry Christmas to you before next week. It's glad to see each one out here. I don't see a visitor, but we may have one. But if we do, we're sure glad you're here. We're in the book of Romans, and last week we spent the whole time on actually 2 verses. So we're going to spend a little more time on that last one. And so I want to go back again to verse 15, and I'm going to read from there through the end of the chapter. I know that's a long reading, but as Ronnie has said before, at least we'll get something out of the class tonight. We'll get to read that much from God's Word. This is a very important chapter, and if we get this down, I think it opens up a lot of stuff for the rest of the book. But the reason I want to start at 15 is because Paul is a missionary. And what Paul is trying to do is save the world. He's doing his very best, one person at a time, and many at a time when he had the opportunity to preach before others, to preach the gospel to folks. And that's the reason he said he was not ashamed to go to Rome and preach the gospel, because he knew if he could get Rome and preach there, he could save some folks. And he had fruit among other Gentiles and other places. So he felt that, and that's the key right there to the rest of this chapter. And if we forget that and get all tied up in some of this other stuff, then we may not remember what Paul's mission was and what his desire was. So that's the reason I'm going to start at verse 15. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are in Rome also, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifested. Brother Camp says that should be among, and I wrote that down. I think what it says under there is in. Known of God is manifested among them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meat. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge of God, gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debates, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them. When we see this great list of sins down here at the bottom, we realize why in verse 18 he starts out with, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. That's quite a list there. Most commentators and most people that I read, and that several of them say that we should have a division between 17 and 18. I can't really see it because it starts with 4, and that refers back to 17. But they say from verse 18 on through the end of the chapter is written about the Gentiles and for the Gentiles. Brother Kemp disagrees with that. He says it's about everybody because you can read of many of these sins and things that these folks did of the Jews, which is true. But and I think when it says they and them, it's talking about the Gentiles. I'm going to have to go along with that. But let's remember, as we study this, and when we get to the end of it, that we realize that Paul is writing this because of his wanting to get the gospel to them. And he's writing to the church. And so these things that he's talking about here, a lot of it are outside the church because these things would not be allowed in the church. So that's something we need to think of. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. We talked about this last week. We realize that he's talking about sin when he's talking about ungodliness and unrighteousness. We realize that God is a just God and that those that commit sin will have to face God one day. And he says he's coming back for those that know not God and obey not the gospel in a fiery flames to bring vengeance upon them. And we looked at that last week. But let's think about, from the beginning of time, God has always been against sin. He has always, and I like to use this in my studies sometimes, especially with the Joel Miller film strip, that from the beginning of time, when man obeys God, God blesses him, but when he disobeys God, God punishes him. And we can see that from the very beginning, that the wrath of God has always been against sin. We know that Adam and Eve, God gave them one command, and they messed that up. They sinned. Therefore, God had to punish them. We know that Cain and Abel, because of God not being pleased with his worship, and it is implied there that God had told them, revealed to them exactly how he wanted them to worship, and his worship was not pleasing to God. Therefore, he became jealous and killed his brother, and God punished him and ran him away from the family. As we go on, we find Noah just a short time later in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Noah, the whole world was wicked. It was so bad that God wanted to destroy everybody, but Noah found favor in the eyes of God. Noah is a do-gooder. He is a good man. He is the one that found favor because he was living correctly and was not sinning, and because of that, God found favor. So God blessed him and saved him through the ark. But the ones that have disobeyed God, all the way through the history, God is punished. That is the way God is. As we look on, we see Abraham. Abraham was the father of the faithful. Abraham was a very, very good, righteous man. God told him, says, I want you to just get up from here and leave your country and go out. Didn't tell him where he was going, didn't tell him how long, how he was going. He just told him to go. And it was up to Abraham, and Abraham just got his stuff up and left. He didn't say, why me, God? Where you want me going? Nothing. He just went. Abraham obeyed God. He obeyed God, even to the point of taking his son's life for God. God told him to do that. He didn't have to, but he was that willing to obey God. Therefore, God blessed him, and blessed him in many, many ways. You know, he had a nephew by the name of Lot. Lot was a good man, but he went to a bad place. He went to a place where it was very, very evil, and we know of Sodom and Gomorrah and how bad it really got. But because Lot was righteous, Lot was allowed to leave. He and his 2 daughters, I believe, if that's correct. Have I got that right? I think that's right. His wife was going with him, but remember, she looked back and God told him not to. She disobeyed God, and what happened to her? See, she disobeyed. She's turned into a pillar of salt, but Lot got to, he got to go, and I bet you he wanted to look back. Don't you know that? But he obeyed God. He knew that if he obeyed God, he would be blessed. But if you disobey God, you're punished. And that is the very nature of God. That's why God is just. That's why God has been just. That's why God will be just. And when he tells me and you that if we obey the gospel, we follow his teaching. If we go in the New Testament and we study and we find out what God wants us to do and we obey that, we're going to have a home in heaven. He tells us that. He is just, and we can depend on that. But he also tells us that if we do not, that if we're unrighteous, if we're ungodly, then we'll be lost in eternity in hell. So this verse here is the beginning, and he tells that, and he talks about who holds the truth in unrighteousness. How can somebody hold the truth in unrighteousness? It's someone that knows what's right and wrong and then don't do it, you know. Someone knows the difference. And here we're going to find out that the truth was revealed to the Gentiles, just like it was to the Jews, but in a different way. It was through revelation that they received it. It was through revelation from God, but it was also through the revelation from the Jews teaching them. As Abraham went about from one place to the other, he talked about the living God, and he let people know about that. And we can understand that they began to know that from the many Israelites that had the revealed will from God as they moved on. And I meant to get on up to Moses when I was talking about those folks that had obeyed God, because, you know, Moses obeyed God and led the people out of Israel, but he got punished. Right there at the end of the thing, he did a thing that God told him to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock. That small of a thing, and he was punished by God, didn't get to go. So when we talk about the lawgiver Moses, and Moses gave the law to the Israelites, and when we talk about the law of Moses, it was to the Israelites. The Gentiles did not come under that law. Now, there were some that were called strangers that lived and were proselytes and became Jews. They were under the law of Moses and had certain rules for them. But the Gentiles at that particular time were not under the law of Moses. You see, there was the patriarchal age, and then the Mosaical age, and then the Christian age. They were under the patriarchal age all the way through the Mosaic age in that time period. So if they were going to be righteous and serve God, they would have to do it under the patriarchal age. And I think we all understand that. And it says, because that which may be known of God is manifested among them, for God has showed it unto them. And that's what verse 19 is teaching. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. The invisible things of him. I think about the air that we breathe. I think about the wind that we can't see. All the blessings that God gives us, the heat, just many, many things that God gives us. It proves that he's a God that we can't even see, and no one has actually seen him. I think Moses saw his back one time, if I've got that correctly. But anyway, the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen and understood by the things that are made. So when we see the world, the trees, the beauty of it, those things prove that God is God. And it should prove to the Gentile, just like it does the Jew, that God was the creator of all this. Then it says, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. God's eternal power. Think about his power. His power that proved that he was God. He proved that many, many times, and the Gentiles saw that. He proved it through miracles. First he proved it actually by the creation. But then the next miracle that he proved was the flood. That was a miracle. He told them that he was going to destroy the world by water, and he did exactly that. That was a miracle. He proved that he was God there. He proved that he was God by sending fire and consuming Nadab and Abihu because that they had sinned. He proved that he was God by sending fire and destroying the sacrifice and the water and the altar and everything when Elijah asked him to. And the prophets of Baal had begged and begged for that to happen. It didn't happen. But God proved that he was God over and over again. There's also a thing that we need to think about, that he revealed that he was God to these folks. Remember Rahab when he hid the spies? When they came up there and were asked to be hid, and she said she would hide them, she said she knew them because of things that they had done. It had been revealed to her in some way or another about the Jews and about God, and that was the reason that she hid them. She was also a good doer and was blessed in that. So we see that the eternal powers and the Godhead, so that they are without excuse. The Gentiles have no excuse for not following God. Any comments? Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart were darkened. Because that when they knew God. Now, knew has to do, the word knew means that it was before now. And when they knew God, see, the Gentiles at one time had been exposed to God quite a bit. But during this time, when from the time of Moses up into the time of Christ, there was quite a period of time there. And during that time, the Gentiles had gotten completely away from God. And it is I am convinced that that's the reason it says when they knew God, but then when they knew him, they still glorified him not. Now, glorified is another word for worship. They didn't worship God. And I think that, I know that when we don't worship God, that is when we get weak. When I was a fireman and I had to work every third day, Brandon can tell you this, that week that I had to work Sunday and had to work Wednesday, it was more tempting not to go the next Sunday, especially if I worked that Saturday before. It just seemed like, boy, I could find every excuse not to worship. And when you fall into that and you don't worship because of that, then you get weak and you get weaker and you get weaker. And I back when I was a boy, I was kind of like Ronnie said, I was drugged to church. I was drugged. And I went fighting and screaming because I didn't really like it. But now that I'm older and I understand and I know God and I understand God and I absolutely love worship. I just cannot wait till the time to worship. And it's the happiest time of my life every week is to get to come and worship. And so I can't understand why they did not want to worship God. But evidently they stopped. And then it says, neither were they thankful. Well, how can you not be thankful for God, for what he's done to us and what he's given us? We wouldn't even be without him. But became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Vain in their imaginations because of not going. When you stay away from God, you're not praying to him, you're not worshiping him, then your mind changes, and you begin to imagine things, and things become really hard for you to understand and know about God. You just move away from him. Their foolish heart was darkened. The light of God was gone from their heart. It became dark, and they did not have that light of him burning in them. And this is talking about the Gentiles at that time. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. I remember when we look at Acts, the 17th chapter, Athens, I mentioned this before, and this makes me think of those folks. Every time I see this, them people, they thought that thought they hung the moon. They were really, really sharp people. They thought they were the wisest people. But when we read about what they actually worshiped, they worshiped idols. And they only had a sign there that said to the unknown God. They didn't even know who God was. And so we realize that they were professing themselves to be wise, but they were really fools. And they didn't accept when Paul taught them, he said, we will hear this again. I don't know if they ever had that opportunity. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Some of these verses just make me angry. But it says that God gave them up to uncleanness. There's 3 times in the first chapter of Romans that God gave them up. 24, 26, and 28. 24, he gave them up to uncleanness, which has to do with their relationships. They had the wrong relationships, and their lust in their heart became wrong, and it changed the truth of God. What is the truth into a lie? And it didn't say that God lied, but it says that his truth was changed into a lie. And they worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever and ever. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, wrong living. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of the error which was meet. There are folks that would have you to know and would tell you that homosexuality is the way you're born. You're born to either be a homosexual or you're born to be a heterosexual. That is a lie. I never believed that. Homosexuality is a sin. A person that is a homosexuality, not that God hates them or has that against them, it is the sin that God hates. And this particular sin is one that will cause them to be lost. And the Bible plainly teaches this here. And this is what the Gentiles were doing. And if you study a little bit about their past, you find out that there wasn't much that they didn't do. They had big-time orgies and parties and drunks and stuff, and they really lived wrong. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind and to do those things which are not convenient. So God gave their mind over to be a reprobate mind. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. They had become darkened in their heart. They had quit worshiping God. They had quit thanking God. And so God just allowed that knowledge. He gave them over to a reprobate mind. I remember watching, y'all might have watched John Wayne some and watched him in the movie Shane. And in that movie, several times, he said, a man ought to do what a man wants to do. And in that, he was talking about that if a man wants to do something, he ought to be able to do it. Well, God gives that privilege to each of us. If we want to do something, God will allow us. He won't stop us. He'll let us do whatever we want to do, no matter how wrong it is. He won't stop us. But he'll allow us to do whatever we want to do. And we can see that that's exactly what these folks were doing. They were doing what they wanted to do. Therefore, God was giving them over to, he gave them up to uncleanness through the lust. He gave them up unto vile affections. And he gave them up to a reprobate mind. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers. This is the ones that get me. You talk about, here we've got murderers. We've got, of course, we've talked about the homosexuals. we've got wickedness, we've got fornication, unrighteousness, and then we get down here and he says whisperers. Whisperers. Who are whisperers? Gossipers, right? That's what he's talking about, gossipers, backbiters, people that go behind your back. Won't come to your face and tell you when you've got something that's sin in your life, but go around and talk to someone else. Backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection. Without natural affection, that goes back to what we talked about earlier. Implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death. Worthy of death. The word death here and other places in the Bible is the word separation. It's not talking about the physical death. It's talking about death, the separation from God forever and ever. Worthy of that death. Not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. I'm sure I left out something that I had planned to say, but I'm right on 7:30, so I'm giving you some time here. I know somebody's got something to say. I got through chapter 1, can you believe it? I guess Ronnie's waiting until he gets to preach, and then he's going to say some things about it. He usually does. All right, then. Y'all got probably about 2 minutes.